Okay, we are ready. Um, Welcome everyone, those who are here in Zoom and the ones following us through our fan page on Facebook. My name is Kimberly, and I'm the chair of this session. It's a great honor for me to introduce our second uh, guest speaker today, Dr. Maribel Montero-Pérez, who is talking about multimodal input in technology enhanced listening. Okay. Dr. Montero is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at Ghent University in Belgium, where she teaches courses on language teaching methodology and research methods for second language acquisition. She has published numerous articles on the role of different types of multimodal input for second and foreign language learning. More particularly, she investigates the role of subtitled and captioned video for listening comprehension and vocabulary learning. Her research has been published in, amongst others, the Modern Language Journal, Studies in Second Language Acquisition, Language Learning and Technology, Computer Assisted Language Learning, Calico Journal, and System. She was guest editor with Michael Rogers at Carleton University in Canada of a special issue on video and language learning for the Language Learning Journal. So now I will step aside so that we can all focus on her presentation. So Dr. Montero, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. First of all, thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm very happy to be part of this conference and to be able to give a presentation about a topic that I have been interested in for a while now, and it is the role of multimodal input in second or foreign language learning. And in this presentation, I will focus on its role in technology-enhanced L2 listening. Okay, so here are the aspects that I would like to focus on today. First, we will have a look at the characteristics of multimodal input. What is it? Why is it important in L2 learning? And how can we use it in technology-enhanced listening? Next, we will look at its effect on L2 listening, on bottom-up processes and on comprehension. And we will also, or I will say a few words about L2 learners' use of multimodal input and L2 teachers' use of multimodal input. And to conclude, we'll have a look at a number of future research perspectives. Okay, so let's have a look at multimodal input. What is it? Why do we want to use it? And how can we use it? So when we talk about multimodal input, we refer to input that contains a combination of input modes of resources that we can use to get to the meaning of the input. And the example that we see here is actually a screenshot from a TV series. So we have audiovisual input, which means that we have the audio, we have visuals, and we can have on-screen text. However, if we look at it more closely, actually, we see that there are a lot of features in the input that can give information, that can provide, that can help our input comprehension. So, for instance, when we think about the audio, well, we have intonation, we have pace, we have language use, register, and so on. When we have a look at the images, we have gestures, we see eye gaze, facial expressions, body movements, etc. And we can have on-screen text in the language of the video or in a different language, etc. So we have a lot of information, we have a lot of features in the input that can give us information about the meaning of the inputs. And I added a definition of multimodality by Kress and van Leeuwen. They proposed this definition in 2001, and they refer to the use of several semiotic modes in the design of a product or event, together with the particular way in which these modes are combined. And I included this definition because it does not only refer to the presence of different types of input modes or resources, but they also focus on the combination of these resources. So for instance, in the example that we have here, we have a very explicit facial expression. We see a hand gesture, we have the text, okay, no, and we can use all that information. We have actually, information that can, or different input modes that can reinforce each other or complement each other. Multimodality is actually, it's a characteristic of our everyday life. Everything, we could actually say that everything that we do is in some way multimodal. So for instance, this presentation or what we are doing now is a multimodal activity. You are listening to this presentation, hopefully. You can see the slides, you can see me, you can see the presenter, my facial expressions, gestures, and so on. So you are all using all that information while you are listening to this presentation. Multimodality is a characteristic of everyday life, but it is also an important characteristic of computer-assisted language learning environments. So Chappell said, multimodality is a characteristic of call environments, and technology call environments present new options for multimodal input. And we will see a number of examples in the next slides. Okay, so if we look at multimodal input and how it has been studied in call literature and in SLA literature, we can see that it can come in many different forms. We have, for instance, reading while listening activities where we have the audio, we have the text, readers read or learners read while they are listening. They can often, very often, they are complementary images that may clarify some of the aspects of the story and so on. We can also have static text with multimodal annotations, as you can see in the example on the screen. We have a written text and a difficult or an unknown word. And for the unknown word, we have a multimodal annotation that contains a picture and definition. But we can also have audiovisual input. And audiovisual input is the type of multimodal input that I will focus on in this presentation. Why multimodal input? Why audiovisual input? Is the next question that I would like to focus on. Why would we use it? Why is it an interesting type of input for L2 learning and for L2 listening? Well, there are a number of reasons, and I think there are 4 very important reasons that I want to share with you. The first one is, well, the fact that multimodal input and audiovisual input in particular is a type of input that is relatively easy to find. It is available on the internet. Its availability in our daily life is still growing, and it can be accessed from different devices. So we no longer exclusively focus or use TV or DVD to watch TV or a movie, for instance, but we can also use our PC, tablet devices, or smartphones in order to have access to audiovisual input in a different language. It is also available in large quantities for different target languages, and that may be one of its most important advantages for L2 learners. So it is a type of input that is easily available, that is easily accessible. It is also a type of input that learners are very familiar with. So we know that people watch TV on a daily basis. For instance, in Europe, we have reports from the European Commission in which we have numbers on the time, the hours per day that people watch TV in their mother tongue, or in a foreign language. So we know that language learners, language users are very familiar with audiovisual input. It plays a very important role in our daily life, especially in our spare time. So we can see it as a leisure activity, or as an activity that has to be situated in an informal context. And this may, of course, also have a positive effect on learners' motivation when they encounter that type of input that they are already familiar with in the language classroom. So we know that exposure to L2 or to audiovisual input in a foreign language, in second language, happens outside the classroom. We know that from studies on out-of-class exposure, on out-of-class activities of language learners. So we know that they frequently watch TV with subtitles, for instance, or without subtitles in a foreign language, mainly English, or that was the language studied in the studies on this particular topic. And we know that it is not only a frequently used type of input by L2 learners, but it also has a significant effect on L2 learning. So studies have shown that for learners who watch video, subtitled video, or subtitled TV, or TV without subtitles in the target language outside the classroom, well, that can be linked, or their out-of-class viewing behavior can be linked to their vocabulary knowledge. So participants who watch a lot of TV in a foreign language outside the classroom language typically have a larger vocabulary size than participants who do not watch as much audiovisual input. Studies have also found that exposure to subtitled video or video has been linked with higher scores on L2 reading and L2 listening. So we know that learners use it, and when they use it, it can have a positive effect on their proficiency in the target language. There are also, besides the accessibility or the availability outside the classroom, there are also theoretically inspired reasons to use multimodal input and to study multimodal input. And that can also explain why audiovisual input and multimodal input play such an important role, not only in our daily life, but also in research, in call research and SLA research, and especially in the research that we have seen in the last decades. I think that we can link the value of audiovisual input to at least three theoretical perspectives. We have a cognitive SLA approach, or we can link the value of audiovisual input to a cognitive SLA approach, in which, for instance, we find that has, for instance, studied the role of attention in input and its effect on L2 learning. So we have, for instance, recently seen a number of studies on the role of attention for L2 learning and the role of attention in audiovisual input and how that is linked to L2 learning. For instance, studies on learners' attention to new words in subtitled videos and whether their attention is linked to L2 learning and so on. So audiovisual input presents a lot of interesting possibilities for research on attention and L2 learning. It has also been linked to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which says that, well, we learn better from words and pictures than from words alone. Now, audiovisual input, also in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, has been mainly studied in the context of native language learning. But in the context of second language learning, we also see a number of studies on the role of audiovisual input that have studied specific principles from the multimedia learning theory, such as, for instance, the spatial and temporal contiguity principle. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So there are a number of theoretical perspectives that can be linked with the use or the value of audiovisual input and multimodal input in general. And then a fourth reason that I would like to put forward is the fact that multimodal input and audiovisual input can be considered a rich and authentic source of input, which has important benefits for instructed settings for the formal language classroom. Why? Well, there are a number of studies that have looked at these particular aspects and that have focused on the language used in audiovisual input on the one hand, and on the visuals used in audiovisual input on the other. So what do we know about language use in audiovisual input and in TV programs in particular? There have been a number of studies that have compared language use in TV programs to language used in the spoken BNC, for instance, so in spoken corpora, to see to what extent language used in TV corpora represents natural language use, so naturally occurring language use. And there are not a lot of studies on these topics. This list is not a complete overview, it's a selection, but there are not a lot of studies on this particular topic. What we do see is that, for instance, for formulaic language, well, the frequency of formulaic language in a TV corpus was found to be comparable to the frequency of formulaic language in the spoken BNC. And there are, Bednarek, for instance, showed that TV programs contain similar lexicogrammatical features as in natural language. So we see that there are a number of similarities, so that TV and audiovisual input presents features that we can also find in natural languages. On the other hand, in TV programs and movies, for instance, we do not find as much interruptions or overlaps as in natural language use. We also find overrepresentations of particular features and so on. This is, of course, due to the fact that language in TV series, for instance, represents scripted language, which is very different from, or which is not the case in natural language. However, studies conclude that TV programs, movies, and so on, audiovisual input present a useful addition to textbooks, especially in instructed contexts where exposure to the target language is often very limited. So when we use audiovisual input, we have the audio, the language used in the input, but we also have the visuals. And what do we know about the role of imageries? Well, actually, we do not have a lot of studies on this particular aspect, but findings seem to suggest that the role of imagery and how much information they can give us about the meaning of a particular idea or clip is genre dependent. So for instance, documentaries may present a high video audio correlation. So the relation between what we see on the screen in the images and what we hear in documentaries is typically very strong. In news video text, for instance, this relationship can be can be very different. So their images can be are typically less supportive than in documentaries or in other genres. But so we know that documentaries, for instance, have supportive images, and when we have supportive images, we also know that this can stimulate not only comprehension but also incidental vocabulary learning. However, research into these particular aspects is scarce, and we also know that imagery may lower the vocabulary demands of audiovisual input, which means that also learners with a lower proficiency level can still understand the meaning of audiovisual input, even when they do not understand all or most of the words in the input. But of course, only when the audiovisual input presents enough supportive imagery. So together, I think these reasons can at least partially explain the search of studies into the role of multimodal and audiovisual input for L2 learning. As we can also see in the program of this conference, but also in the program of other call and SLA related conference, we see that there are always last year's presentations on captions, Netflix, audiovisual input, and so on. So it has become a very important topic on the international research agenda. And we can see that in the publication of special issues, for instance, on video and language learning, on language learning from multimodal input, and monographs on that topic. This is again a selection. This is not a complete overview of all that has been published in this area. And that brings me to the how question. So how can we offer multimodal input in technology enhanced settings? Well, we can of course use audiovisual input as such. We can use audiovisual input in the classroom that we find on websites. We can use YouTube. We can use streaming platforms. We can use TV, etc. Learners can watch it on their own PC. We can show it on a larger screen in the classroom and so on. So we can use audiovisual input, yeah, as such. But of course, there are also a lot of learning environments that are based on audiovisual input. As you can see here, again, a very small selection of all that is available. But we have a lot of learning platforms that are based on multimodal or audiovisual input. So we see, for instance, here Netbox, that is a learning environment for L2 learners of Dutch that is entirely based on authentic materials, on video materials and corresponding activities. So we have learning environments. We have a lot of audiovisual input that we can find everywhere on the internet in different target languages, but there are also numerous techniques to add an extra layer to the audiovisual input. We can add an extra layer in the form of on-screen text, and that is what I will mainly focus on in this presentation. It is an additional layer that learners can use to understand the input in their meaning-making process. And there are different options. The first example that I show you here is a video with on-screen text, which can present which is a translation. So we see a Friends episode. Audio is typically in English, and we can have subtitles in our native language. Of course, in Belgium, or in Flanders at least, this is a very common scenario. When we watch an English movie, we have subtitles in Dutch. In dubbing countries, for instance, I know this is a lot less common, but this is a type of on-screen text or additional layer that we can find not only in our daily life but also in a lot of studies. Then we also have another type of on-screen text that we call captions. These are subtitles in the same language as the audio. So, for instance, we see Jamie Oliver. So he presents something in English. He's cooking, and we have the on-screen text in English as well. So this is what I will call captions in the rest of this presentation. But there are, as I said in the beginning of this presentation, technology presents a lot of new options to enhance audiovisual input. This is an example. We can have, for instance, captions with textual enhancement. We can highlight, for instance, important words in the captions. We can use only keywords or partial captions where we do not show the entire sentence, but we only show the important ideas of a sentence. And we can have captions with glosses, which means that we can click on every word in the sentence to have information about the meaning, to access actually the translation of a word. And the example that I show you here is an example from language learning with Netflix. That is a Google Chrome extension that you can use with your Netflix subscription to have closed captions. I will come back to that type of captioning in the second part of this presentation. So we have a lot of different types of multimodal input or audiovisual input with different types of on-screen text. A lot of different combinations are possible. And this is actually a very authentic technique. So we could say, yeah, this is a technique for language learners. Actually, it is not. But even when we watch TV in our mother tongue, for instance, we are constantly surrounded by audiovisual input with additional layers. And I added two examples here. It is actually in advertising, for instance, it's a frequently used technique to draw viewers' attention to a particular feature, because of course they want to sell their product and they want to make sure that viewers remember the important features of that product. So for instance, and the example that we see here, and I will try to, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse on the screen, but maybe Now you can. So here, for instance, we see, yeah, this will not make your skin look shiny. So this is a very important feature. So please buy our product and please remember this information. So here again, this was taken from a news report for native native language speakers, but there as well we see that they use keywords. We see this is about the work-life balance, so they added a balanced work-life to visualize actually what they were presenting. So also in our mother tongue, when I watch TV in Dutch, for instance, I see, this was in French, but when I watch TV, I constantly see examples of audiovisual input with additional layers. And then of course we have, for instance, in Netflix, a lot of possibilities to play with audio in different languages and on-screen text in other languages. Okay, so we have a lot of options to realize or to create multimodal input. And this is the last example that I want to show. Why? Well, because YouTube and social media have added new types of multimodal input. We could say that, this actually takes it to the next level. What we have here is a React video. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but this is a type of video where you see someone who watches another video clip, and you have both on the screen. So we have the person who watches a Friends episode, we see him on the screen, we see him react to that particular episode, and he says, oh yes, I loved this episode. So we have information about the person who is watching, and we also have information about the original video clip. So as a viewer, we can use those different sources to understand what we see. Okay, so we know what multimodal input is, how it can look, and now we will have a look at what we know about the effects of multimodal input for L2 listening. And I will look at a number of studies that have investigated the effects of audiovisual input and the role of on-screen text. So in order to understand why multimodal input can be useful, very briefly, let's have a look at what listening means, but I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. We have Van der Grift, for instance, defined listening as a learner's ability to use an interaction of bottom-up and top-down processes. So learners need to be able to recognize particular words in the speech stream, they need to decode the input, but they also need to use prior knowledge about a particular topic, for instance, and they can use all that information to get to the meaning of the input. The question is, how can we use multimodal input to stimulate these processes? And I will focus on these three types of on-screen text. So for learners' bottom-up processes, we know from research by Go, for instance, that word recognition and speech decoding is a very frequent listening problem. And if we look at research that has been conducted on audiovisual input, well, we see that captions, for instance, have the potential to facilitate learners' word recognition. Well, why? Because learners have the written text on the screen, so they can map the audio and the script to decode the language. This means that they need less time to decode the input and that they have more time left to understand the meaning of the video. However, captions have also been criticized in studies on listening because they might interfere with the strategies that learners need for authentic listening, or learners might rely too much on captions and read too much, which might prevent their listening development. So the question that is then, what do we know about the effect of audiovisual input with captions and their effects on learners' ability to decode spoken input? So again, we're talking about captions here, so audio in the L2 and on-screen text in the L2. There have been a number of studies, not a lot, and I give a few examples here. And in these studies, so for instance, in Mitter and McQueen, participants had to watch a 25-minute video with L1 subtitles or with captions. And what they found in that study was that even already after a 25-minute video exposure, participants were able to adapt to a new or an unfamiliar accent that was used in the video clip. So they found that captions were helpful for recognizing words or known utterances, so utterances used in the video on a post test, but they also saw that it was helpful for new items. And it was also found in the study by Charles and Trenkage, for instance. They found that watching documentaries had a positive effect on learners' speech, on a speech segmentation test, which consisted of known sentences, but also of unknown ones. So these findings suggest that watching captioned video has a positive effect on learners' speech decoding. However, a very important comment here is that these studies, all studies, also Wisniewska and Mora, for instance, looked at higher, intermediate, or advanced learners. And actually very little is known about the effects of captioned video on learners' speech decoding skills at lower proficiency levels. Okay, so this was for this was very briefly something about bottom-up processes. So let's have a look now at comprehension. What do we know about the role of audiovisual input for comprehension? And I included the results of a meta-analysis that I conducted on the effects of captions as compared to no captions on learners' comprehension of video. It summarizes results from 15 studies and published before 2013. And what we see is that there is a large effect for captions as compared to no captions. So participants in the captioning group had significantly higher scores on a comprehension test than participants in the no captions group. And this result has been confirmed in follow-up studies and later studies. However, more recent studies have added other aspects that we should take into account, like for instance, the pace of the video. Mayer and colleagues found that, well, captions are helpful for comprehension, but only when the pace of the video is slow enough to give learners enough time to process the captions. So there have been a lot of additional studies on this particular topic, but I have to keep an eye on the time, so I will immediately go to the study that I would like to focus on in this part. And that is a study that was part of Isabeau Fievé's PhD research that I supervised together with Frédéric Cornely and Peter Smet. And in this study, participants watched a French Netflix series. So French was the target language in this study. And they watched the series with the Google Chrome extension language learning with Netflix. So this means that participants watched the clip with captions, and they also had access to the gloss, as you can see on the screen. So this means that they could click on every word in the captions to request its translation. And in this study, we looked at learners' comprehension of the series, and as measured by a comprehension test that consisted of audio-based questions and questions based on audio and images. And the questions also included inferential questions and textual questions. I will come back to that in a minute. And we also looked at learners' comprehension and factors that influence learners' comprehension. So for instance, does their use of the glosses in the language learning with Netflix application influence their comprehension? Does their prior vocabulary knowledge influence their comprehension? Does the episode influence their comprehension because they watched an entire season? And does the type of comprehension question have an impact on their scores? So they watched an entire TV series through 331 minutes of exposure in an informal setting, and they could use the language learning with Netflix extension. Participants were 67 L2 learners of French who had Dutch as L1, and they were considered low to high intermediate learners. All participants watched a TV series with captions, and it was a meaning-focused activity, which means that they focused on the meaning while they were watching the video or the series, and they knew that they would have to complete a comprehension test after each episode. The comprehension test in this study consisted of audio and audio plus image questions, which means that for questions based on the audio, participants could or they needed the audio to understand that question. No information was given in the images. So this means that they had to use what they heard to understand or to give an answer to the question. In the audio plus image questions, well, they had, or the answer could be found in the images, but in the audio, but also in the images. So they could use both sources to answer that question. By doing so, we wanted to take into account the multimodal nature of the input, because in a lot of studies on comprehension of audiovisual input, this particular aspect is not taken into account. But recently there have been a number of studies, and you can see them on the screen, that have also looked at the role of audio-based question and audio plus images-based questions, just to take into account the multimodal nature of the input. So let's have a brief look at the results of this study. With regard to the use of the glosses, well, actually we can see that participants did not use them a lot. So on average, they looked up 11 words per episode, which is not a lot. There was also a lot of individual variation in the score. So you see, for instance, that there is a minimum here of 0 lookups, but some participants, they looked up 157 words in a particular episode. We hypothesized that this was related to their prior vocabulary knowledge, but this was not the case. This was this for their lookup behavior. So actually, they did not use the gloss a lot, but there were a lot of individual differences in the results. For the scores on the comprehension test, we see that, generally speaking, we see that they have the highest scores on the audiovisual questions, on the audiovisual and inferential comprehension questions, and audiovisual and textual comprehension questions. And scores are lower for the audio questions. However, we see that their scores are relatively high on the test. So how can we, or which factors or predictors influence learners' comprehension scores? That was the second research question in this study. Well, we already saw that learners did not use the gloss a lot. And when we included their lookup behavior in the analysis, we also saw that their lookup behavior did not affect their performance on the comprehension test. However, the images or the audiovisual questions had significantly higher scores than the audio-based questions, which shows that participants actually or used the images, or that the images were helpful to answer the comprehension questions. We also saw that the last episode was that comprehension scores on the last episode were significantly better than on the first episodes, which might be due to the fact that they had or their top-down processes helped them. For instance, this is the input that they had in this study was a TV series. So this is input that is serial in nature, which means that they have information about the setting, or they already are familiar with the characters in the series. They know particular context and so on. So this may have helped them to understand the input. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. So I will just say a few words about another study. So this was one on glossed captions and with a comprehension test that looked into audio and audio plus image-based questions in order to take into account multimodal nature of the input. Another type of captioning that I have focused on is keyword captioning. Why? Well, the rationale behind the use of this type of captions is that they only present words that are important for the meaning in order to reduce learners' reading or reliance on the captions. And in this study that you can find in Recall, if you want to know more about this study, 226 intermediate L2 learners of French watched 3 short videos. And then they took a global and detailed comprehension test. And what we see is that on the global comprehension test, participants in the full captioning group, there were 3 groups, participants in the full captioning group outperformed participants in the keyword captioning group and in the no captioning group. There were no differences between the keyword and no captioning group. However, on the detailed comprehension test, no differences were found between the conditions. So these results seem to suggest that keywords were not very helpful to stimulate learners' comprehension. And another important aspect that we should take into account are learners' perceptions. And in this study, we found that participants who had keywords actually indicated that they would not use them if they could, or if they were free to choose. So they said that they found keywords distracting and that they hampered their listening experience. So even if keywords, in this study it was not the case, but in other studies keywords were found to be helpful, yeah, we should maybe take into account learners' perceptions. And in this study, they were not very positive about keywords. However, I still think that they might play a role in differentiated instruction, for instance. So in the classroom, we could say, well, we start with full captions, and then they watch the video again with keyword captions. They still have some kind of support, but they don't have the entire caption anymore. However, this is still a question that might inspire future research. Okay, I will skip this and go to the last part of my presentation. I would just like to say a few words about learners' use of multimodal input. There are not a lot of studies on this particular aspect, but we do know for instance, from self-reported data that when learners have audiovisual input with captions, they report that their main focus of attention is on the captions. However, when it comes to the usefulness, they think that images were more useful than captions for supporting their comprehension or learning. This was a study with beginning learners. In eye tracking studies, or eye tracking studies also have a number of important findings for future research on audiovisual and multimodal input. For instance, they have shown that learners automatically read captions and subtitles, even when they are not familiar with the target language, even when they are beginning learners. And studies also show that even with captions or with subtitles, learners have time left to process visuals. So for instance, Winky and colleagues found percentages of 66% or 69%, and they said that, well, of the time that captions were shown on the screen, participants spent approximately 70% on the captions, which means that they still have some time left to look at the images and to use information from the images. But there are a lot of aspects that, or questions that might inspire future research. So for instance, here we have information about how much time they spend on on-screen text, but very little is known about how learners use other types of information and what they use in the visuals. So for instance, what do they look at when they watch a video in the target language and so on? These are still questions that might, that require further research. And a last thing that I would like to focus on is learn L2 teachers' use of multimodal input, because we have all these studies about what works and what doesn't work for stimulating or promoting learners' listening and learners' comprehension of audiovisual input. And these have interesting implications for the L2 classroom. But actually very little is known about L2 teachers' use of this type of input in the L2 classroom, or about their beliefs of L2 audiovisual input in the language classroom. And these are preliminary results from a study that we are conducting. And you can see all the people who work on this study on the slide. What we see for captions and subtitles, for instance, is that teachers think that captions are important, more important than subtitles for L2 learning. They use captions more often than subtitles. And when we look at listening and comprehension, well, we see that teachers think that captions can help improve learners' listening and learners' comprehension of the input. Subtitles are also considered helpful, but we see that they are more positive about captions than about subtitles. But again, these are only preliminary results of a study that we are still preparing, and that contains a lot of other types of multimodal input besides captions and subtitles. What do we know from previous research on audiovisual input and its role in L2 listening? Well, we know that it can support and even promote speech decoding, especially for advanced learners. We also know that audiovisual input with captions can promote learners' comprehension, can give them more time to focus on the input, and can also lead to more enjoyable viewing experience for L2 learners. However, the selection of multimodal input is a crucial, is a very difficult and also a crucial part and task for the L2 teacher, for instance, if he wants to use it or she wants to use it in the language classroom. And there are a number of aspects that we need to take into account, such as, for instance, the goal of the activity. Do we want to focus on comprehension, or do you want to stimulate their listening, promote their listening skills, and so on? But we need, we already have a lot of information, but of course, there are still a lot of questions that need to be answered. And there are, and I think that, we need more research that takes into account the multimodal nature of input in order to better understand how learners use a multimodal and audiovisual input for listening comprehension. And I think that measurement instruments play a very important role in this, for this particular question. Combination of online measurements such as eye tracking and offline measures such as simulated recall, for instance, could be very helpful in this to answer these questions. We need more research on the role of multimodal input for speech decoding and whether it actually promotes listening for other learners or for learners with other proficiency levels than advanced learners. And I think that the multimodality of our everyday life, it is so present in our everyday life that it has important implications not only for the classroom but potentially also for listening tests. And this is probably something that will be discussed in tomorrow's keynote presentation and tomorrow's program as well. Okay, so I had a lot of things that I wanted to share with you, so maybe it was a bit fast, but I want to thank you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Montero. I enjoyed your presentation. And now, as for the audience, please feel free to turn on your cameras to see each other, right? And open your microphones if you have a question for the presenter. You can use the hand reaction in Zoom or use the chat. So I think we already have a question in the chat. Okay, I will read it for you, Dr. Montero. Maria Consuelo, she says, thank you very much for the presentation. My undergraduate thesis project was about the use of movie extracts as multimodal text to enhance the oral output in students from a high school in Chile. So I was very excited to hear about your study. I got a question regarding about the class environment. Throughout your study, did you notice that the students were more motivated to learn the second language and confident enough to use the second language?
Yeah, very good question. I think it clearly has an impact on motivation that has been shown in research because it reduces learners' listening anxiety, and learners also notice that they can deal with input in a foreign language and that they can deal with input that they actually thought was too difficult. So it can be very motivating. There's not a lot of research about motivation and audiovisual input, but the studies that have included aspects about motivation have shown positive effects. Does it have an impact on learners' use of the second language? That is still an open question. There are studies that have shown that when participants, for instance, watch a particular video and then they have to produce output afterwards on the topic of the video. They use vocabulary from the video, for instance. They are able to reuse vocabulary. So it has a positive, or it may have a positive impact on their vocabulary use. Does it enhance their speaking skills? That, I think, is still it's a very interesting question and still an open question. So I think, yeah, for vocabulary, or we can already see some positive effects, but for language use as such, more research should be conducted on that particular aspect. So I want to be very careful there.
All right, so there you go, Maria Consuelo. Thank you so much for your question. We have another one from Joshua Matthews. He says, thank you very much for the valuable and thought-provoking presentation. As you have presented, audiovisual modality is very useful in supporting comprehension. Do you think there is sometimes pedagogical value in limiting channels of information presented to learners, such as just audio and textual modes?
Yeah, I think, well, it all depends on the goal of the activity, I think. And what we very often see in the language classroom is that, or at least in Flanders, is that when they use audiovisual input, for instance, or audio input, they only focus on comprehension. And when I present my, or when I see teachers, I always try to convince them to also use input, audio input or audiovisual input to train listening skills. So I think, and I think you published some very interesting studies that I use when I try to convince teachers to also train learners' listening skills. So I think, yes, definitely, we can use audio, we can use textual modes. Well, textual modes would be different, of course, or the goal would be different. But on the other hand, I think that we should not be afraid to use audiovisual input because, and also in listening activities, because that is the type, or that is, it is a type of input that is so common in everyday life. Everything that we do, we have different modalities, and sometimes I wonder if, in terms of authenticity, if audio for L2 learners is still audio only, is it still enough? But it could be still part of an activity, I think, if we also use other activities. So I think it all depends on the goal of the activity, but I think there's definitely still value in using only audio, for instance, in the classroom.
All right, perfect. Yeah, he says, thank you very much. I agree with the huge value of audio visual. We have Sebastián Alarios. Do you want to open your microphone? Yes.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Maribel, for the presentation. Very thought-provoking. And I have the following question. I'm particularly interested in helping students develop their bottom-up decoding skills. And you mentioned that there is evidence that using captions can help them better decode what they're listening. What I was wondering is if you're aware of any evidence that this same strategy also has a positive impact later on when they have to decode something without the captions.
Yeah, there are not a lot of studies, but the three studies that I mentioned showed or suggest that the effects are generalizable or might be generalizable beyond the input used. But I think, yeah, this is also an area where we need more research, and especially for beginning or lower intermediate learners who have smaller vocabulary sizes. And we know that vocabulary size has is crucial for word recognition and for speech decoding. So I think it will definitely still help. But we don't have enough research on beginning level learners. But the studies that we have on advanced learners suggest that it also helps for new inputs. So for new sentences in the tests that they used. So based on that, I would definitely recommend it.
Thank you.
Anyone else would like to ask a question? Any comments? You can write on the chat or use your microphone. Maybe about the techniques, the type of captions, or the YouTube reaction videos, that those are very useful. I bet that we are, many of us are familiar with it. Someone says yes. Thank you. So if there are any other question? No? 3, 2, 1, I don't know. Professor Monica, do you want to say something?
Yes, I have a question, Maribel, because, well, we've been working with one of my former students. We've tried to put together a study in which we have had the chance to retrieve the caption support. So we started with full caption, sentence level caption, and keyword caption. But we have looked at perceptions. We haven't measured anything to do with learning gains or listening gains or learning at the vocabulary level or anything like that. And well, although the scope is a bit different, what we found in this research is that, yeah, there is this perception that retrieval of captions is needed because there is an over-reliance on them, right? And we as teachers, particularly as classroom instructors, will need to find ways to do that. So that's as you mentioned before, that's right out there, a beautiful piece of research for people looking for studies or for topics and to investigate, because it hasn't been researched much, right? I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of studies with fixed groups where learners did not have choices, so they had to watch a video with full captions or with keyword captions and so on. But I think if we look at classroom practice, it is not one or the other, and teachers can play with the types of multimodal input, taking into account the beneficial effects that have been associated with the different types of on-screen text. Learners as well could play with the different types of on-screen text in different stages of a particular activity. So I think that with all the information that we have from the studies so far, we can really play around in our classroom with different types of on-screen text and and show our learners like, okay, these are full captions. You could start by using full captions. Learners who feel very comfortable could only activate keyword captions. Why not use L1 subtitles in the first viewing and then go to captions, for instance, in a second viewing? We can do a lot of different things, and I think that is also one of the maybe main implications of all the studies that we have on-screen text and audiovisual input, that it is not one or the other, that we can use them in our classroom and see where the needs of the learners are, how learners think about the different types of captions, because there are learners who like keyword captions, there are learners who like full captions, there are learners who want to try it without captions. So we can use it as differentiated materials, and I think that is also one of the advantages of audiovisual input, but also one of the difficulties, because creating these materials is a very time-consuming task, and I think that material designers should play a very important role in this story, and it would be great if textbooks, for instance, would come with audiovisual input with different types of on-screen text that teachers can use, and to make sure that they don't have to create the materials themselves every time, because that is very time consuming.
All right. Thank you, you all. Thank you all for your questions. And I would like to especially thank Dr. Montero for a very thought-provoking and insightful presentation. I did enjoy it, and I learned a lot from it. So now this is for everybody. Please stay here in this room for the closing remarks with Professor Tanya Hunt. So, Professor?
Thank you, Maribel. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Maribel, for your wonderful presentation. I'm sure that everyone is now happy to have learned something else, something different, or probably they have reinforced, reassured their own knowledge on the topic as well. Thank you very much.